Why would a few words written on a piece of paper collapse an entire country's economy? Now, when people think of why so many African countries are poor, alternative explanations like war, corruption, and colonialism are usually given as the reasons for why the continent is home to some of the poorest nations in the world. But the thing is, there's one country that spent decades languishing in poverty despite the fact that it never suffered a civil war, it had a government committed to fighting corruption, and it was freely given its independence without any violence. This nation actually started off on a better foot than virtually all of its neighbors, and yet, within a generation of independence, its economy had almost completely collapsed and the country was on the brink of starvation. So, what country could have possibly destroyed itself so quickly with just 5 simple words? In 1964, the former British colonies of Tanganyika and Zanzibar merged to create a single united republic. The next year, the country's first constitution proclaimed that the government would intervene actively in the economic life of the nation so as to prevent the accumulation of wealth. Those 5 words were enshrined in the supreme law of the land by the country's first president, Julius Nyerere. After being introduced to the concept of Marxism during his time studying at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, he became convinced that African socialism was the key to prosperity for the newly formed United Republic of Tanzania. And to his credit, he technically succeeded. The Tanzanian government did in fact prevent the accumulation of wealth. After nationalizing virtually every major industry in the country, including all commercial real estate and banks, Tanzania's socialist government turned its eyes toward the agricultural sector of the economy. Under a process known as villagization, farmers who refused to join the government-mandated communal villages were considered enemies of the state. Thousands were jailed as political prisoners while police began to round up anyone who wasn't living in a city and force them to move into the villages. By the end, more than 13 million people were forcibly relocated into 7,000 villages, representing over 90% of the entire country's rural population. And the result was an unmitigated disaster. Agricultural output collapsed by 50%. After just a few years, many were relying on famine relief just to avoid starvation. Despite having been a net exporter of food at the time of independence, now food imports soared dramatically, and inflation ran out of control at over 35% per year. As the economist Thomas Sowell points out, all of this happened in a country that received more foreign aid per capita than any other nation in the world at the time. But perhaps what is most disturbing is that all of this was entirely predictable. It's not as if these kinds of economic policies had not been tried before to similarly devastating effects. And yet, foreign aid allowed the regime to limp along for decades until finally, even piles of aid money wasn't enough to hide the reality of the horrors of bad economic policy, not to mention the violence that was required to implement it. The good news is that countries like Botswana have shown that another way is possible. Just like Marxist ideas never work wherever they're tried, free market ideas, to include private property rights and stable governments, succeed no matter where they're tried.